Bonjour, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vous invite à chausser vos casques. On démarre cette matinée consacrée à l'éolien en mer. Donc voilà, mettez.
Welcome to this session. Put on your headsets, please, and we'll start this roundtable. Thank you very much for taking up the invitation issued by EnerGaïa. We're on to the second and last day. This morning we'll be talking about offshore wind and these structures. Before we welcome our speakers, I'd like to call on Christophe Malas to come up to the podium. Could he please join us here?
Je vous donne le micro.
I'll give you the microphone.
Ou pas, vous n'avez pas obligatoirement besoin, puisque c'est vous qui parlez.
Vous m'entendez?
I hope you can all hear me. It's very odd to speak to nobody, so to speak, but
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
welcome.
Voilà, c'est moderne, mais c'est un peu plus lourd que du papier.
And this is very modern. It's a bit heavier than paper. Sorry, it's taking a bit of time to put things together here.
Je crois que j'ai été
I
présenté.
think I've been introduced, but as I didn't hear, I'm Christophe, President of the Euro-Mediterranean entity. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Carole Delga and our Vice President, who's in charge of the coast and the Mediterranean, who I'm sure you know. Welcome to EnerGaïa.
Vous le savez, on va parler
As you know, we're going to talk about offshore wind power in the Mediterranean. And then I noted something. I have a lot of information to give you, in fact, in this respect. EnerGaïa for us has turned into an opportunity to look at the past year and define objectives for the year to come. In 2024,
Donc, dans
we'll
l'attente
finish the year
de connaître le nom des lauréats à
2024.
l'appel
Well,
d'offres
we don't
numéro
know
6.
who will win the call for tenders.
Soyons donc patients.
In a couple of days, we'll know who has won this call for tenders, so be a little bit patient.
Patience comme la mobilisation est ce qui caractérise
Patience, mobilization are characteristic of our area since 2017 with you in this area. We've gone through a lot of stages, which have been long and difficult sometimes, but always in a spirit of progress. I don't want to talk about what's happened since 2017. You would hold that against me. It would take too much time, but I'd like to focus a bit on 2024, which has been a very positive year in terms of construction and structuring of this area of activity. Port infrastructure, that's very important in terms of logistics in Port Nouvelle. We have accelerated its transformation. Over the months, we've seen the work move forward. Equipment has arrived. Things are taking shape, and activities are ever more intense. You can see it from the autoroute when you pass by. This is very good when it comes to our big offshore wind farm in 2026, and people can become organized before the actual opening. I'd like to talk about the coordination work in terms of our ports in Marseille. We've been coordinating things with Marseille, with Fos and Port-la-Nouvelle, and Castan in charge of Port-Noël, and Philippe Nyon, in charge of the work in Fos Marseille, should be greeted and highlighted here. They have a common vision when it comes to the need to have our two ports restructured in order to move forward. We're talking about 3.5 gigawatts by 2035 in terms of offshore wind power. I'd like to thank everyone for this clear map, this clear statement, a blueprint as to where we're going. There's some other very important work done on the port of Sète. The idea is to create a base to support other Mediterranean French ports. And we have Olivier Carme, the general manager, who I wish to mention here. He's perhaps stuck in the traffic. It's sometimes difficult to get into the building. We have the acceptability issue as well. 2024, we launched Mediterranean Fishers Service, and I'd like to welcome the representative who's here in the room. He represents the Fishing Committee. This fishermen's cooperative has involved fishermen with these offshore wind farms. The idea, they help transport technicians, give support to the scientific campaigns, and this is a very important project for the territory. And I'd like to underscore the work done by the Committee of Fishermen. Industry as well. We have pilot farms, FGL and Olmet. We have increasing numbers of enterprises in this area. We have published our plans. We work with enterprises in the aeronautical industry. For example, we have a lot of know-how in many areas locally available. Olivier Perret, who runs FPDA, I talked with him a few minutes ago, and we share his report. Indeed, it's important to underscore the strength of this area of activity and all the players involved. I would urge them to coordinate ever more closely in the future. They'll be talking about their projects later. We have a lot of skills. That's a critical issue, which we identified ever since the beginning of the structuring of this activity in 2017. Now, thanks to the mobilization of a number of players, they conducted an analysis of the situation, and they know where the priorities lie in terms of training and awareness building. We work with universities and companies, the idea being to provide dedicated training programs and education in this area. At 2 p.m. on our booth, together with the University of Montpellier, you can discover exactly what's being done. We have built pilot wind farms. Throughout the year, we've seen these pilot wind farms appear in Pont-la-Nouvelle and in Fosse. These projects benefit all enterprises involved, port enterprises, CEMA, which deals with the infrastructure, and then we have many other companies involved in the various phases of construction. That shows that expertise and industrial know-how are very much present in our territory. I'd like to reach out to the developers. Despite the ups and downs in these pilot projects, they have continued actively to participate in the structuring of this line of activity. Goals for 2025. To continue, of course, consultation and coordination, I would like to announce that the prefect of the region and the president of the region, Carole Delga, have agreed, as of the beginning of next year, to set up a strategic committee on floating offshore wind farms. And the winners of the call for tenders will also set up a special monitoring scheme, the idea being to follow closely the successes of their projects. It's very important for our area that the stakeholders and locally elected people measure the impact of these projects on our local economy and the tourism potential of these projects. We were able to discover with a delegation from the Parliament of the Sea. We went on mission to Holland and Denmark, to the North Sea, and there we visited all the we saw the changes in the ports and in terms of tourism. For example, fishing used to be very powerful some decades ago. Then the focus was oil and gas, and now the focus is renewable offshore energy. And likewise, the industry clusters, we have the ad hoc agencies and a number of expert committees. We'll be setting up a technical group on the automation. In other words, how can we optimize construction work sites in ports through automation? That's quite a challenge for you. We have a lot of expertise and skills in the area. We have good practices and resources, and we want to mobilize them. We want to mobilize you in order to upgrade this line of activity. That's what we need in this region, and of course on all around the French coast. Then we have the commercial phase, of course. I think that today what people want is not to convince others of the need for this energy transition. this ecological transition. The idea now is to be capable through coordination and our know-how. The idea is to pool ideas, to implement things, and to move on to the operational phase. It's up to us to convince to others, to prove things, to conduct the tests and learn from each other. And on our side, as a region, we should be the right coordinator, the right link in the chain. We can coordinate with WindDoc, all our agencies and all our people, taking into account the political dimension, all the lobbying and so on. The idea is to ensure that this is a joint project that truly succeeds, and which will enable us by 2030, 2035 to really meet this challenge that lies before you. That brings me to the end of my introductory speech. I hope that you were able to hear what I said. I wish you a very happy EnerGaïa, and I'm sure that we will gain tremendously in energy just listening to the various discussions here. Thank you very much. Christophe Manas, Regional Councillor in Occitania, President of the Mediterranean Commission. How offshore wind power is structured to stay on course. We have inaugurated new wind farms, and there are new calls for tender. Now we need to organize the operational side of things. What are the challenges for players in this area? We'll talk about this with our various speakers, who I'd like to introduce. So, how will offshore wind power become a pioneer? We'll have Martin Salmon, who is in charge of offshore wind farms. He's works on energy and climate. And then, in terms of the ramping up of this area, we will be welcoming Paul Mantov, who I wish to welcome. He works for the Commission for Energy, and he'll be talking to us about the various calls for tender and the impact on industry. The challenge, as we heard, is also industrial, and to share his vision, we will welcome Olivier Perret, who's president of SLB, head of New Energy Europe, SLB. So please come up, and you will be talking to us about the opportunities for offshore wind. We need to develop a robust, competitive sector together with Maëlie Benistan-Hector, Syndicat des Énergies Renouvelables. We'll hear about all these topics. Thank you very much for joining us here. And we'll talk together about the criteria for calls for tenders and how important it is for this line of activity to be easy to understand. So please use a microphone. We have a speaker here, and things seem to be gaining momentum when it comes to offshore wind farms. Energy transition is a pillar when it comes to the development of wind farms. Has that been confirmed now? Yes, I hope you can all hear me. Indeed, offshore wind farms play an important role. That's confirmed. Let's look at the French policy in this area. There are some tendencies that tend to join up. The idea is to reduce the consumption of energy minus 40% by 2031. In terms of final energy, that's what I wanted to say about energy efficiency and use. And also the idea is to electrify certain uses in order to decarbonate in transport and industry. That means there will be a drop in the consumption of energy, but an increase in the relative share of electricity in the energy mix. This increase in the consumption of electricity in France is totally desirable when the objective is decarbonation. So we'll have more electricity. That also means that our historic nuclear energy power supply will diminish, because some nuclear power plants will be decommissioned. So we have to redevelop this area, working on a different nuclear power plan. We have very ambitious objectives when it comes to onshore wind farms and solar energy, 45 gigawatts by 2050 for offshore wind farms. And we have an intermediate goal of 18 gigawatts. That's in terms of offshore wind energy. We have a very ambitious industrial project. I think later on we'll talk about how we can speed things up. We have to upscale. There was a first change in scale as of 2020. There were a lot of calls for tenders issued. 1 gigawatt by 2023, and then in Brittany, 150 megawatts. That was one of the first commercial projects based on offshore wind energy. And I hope I'll be able to announce very good news when it comes to Mediterranean projects by the end of this year, beginning of next year. That's an important message to convey. We have these two projects in the Mediterranean. We published the specifications for 7 and 8 next year, and the various candidates received the specifications last week for the new call for tenders, and we're preparing the next stage. Thank you very much, Martin Salmon. Now I'd like to turn to Paul-Octave Tolu, Head of Offshore Wind Energy, CRE. So there's great momentum behind offshore wind energy. How are you organizing the calls for tender? As Martin was saying, we have gained a lot of momentum through the regular calls for tenders. Things are very competitive and dynamic. We talk normally about one lot or more, depending on the structure of the offshore wind farms. The idea now is to change scale and take account of several lots or batches. We're talking about 4 different areas, 4 different lots. And thanks to this procedure, we'll be able to diversify the number of winners, and we'll diversify skills and technical resources together with financial resources. The idea is to spread out the industrial risk linked to projects, which obviously call for a lot of skills and entail a number of risks. So that's how we're upscaling. It's a very competitive area. We have 12 candidates who've been pre-selected in October. The idea is to have specifications during the first quarter of 2025 in order to launch the call for tenders and be able to allocate the various areas in 2025-2026. That will lend greater visibility to the area because these projects will come into service around 2030 or 2032. And then we'll upgrade again with IODs. This is a much more massive call for tenders. Between 8 and 10 gigawatts will be allocated. Work is still preliminary. These are projects which will come to service around 2035. So if you add together all these calls for tender, you can see that we're talking about up to 10 years for being brought into service. Yet I would like to say that we're talking about a huge amount of power for these offshore wind farms. Thank you very much. You talked about the players in this line of activity. Together with us, so we have Maëlie Beniston-Hector, who represents the Syndicat des Énergies Renouvelables, SER. Martin and Paul-Octave have given us the landscape, talked about the prospects. What do players in this area want? What do you expect? Do you want new criteria? Do you want these criteria to be revised? Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the welcome. Indeed, there's a lot of momentum gathering around offshore wind energy. We have to ensure that this momentum is positive in terms of impact and implementation for industry in the European economy. This entails having a criteria for the calls for tender 9 and 10. I do think that we have to stand back from the situation. The current context isn't the same as a couple of years ago. The economic situation is quite different when it comes to these calls for tender. We have overcapacity on the part of non-European third-party countries, which are very aggressive and which propose solutions that really compete with European industrial facilities. We can note in these calls for tenders that there is a race to opt for the lowest prices. That doesn't enable the area to be truly profitable. So I think we'll have to work on this in order to preserve this industrial tool, which remains an international leader, but has to be preserved in the forthcoming calls for tender. So we've worked on the criteria with the state services and CRE, and the idea is to revise calls for tender 9 and 10. This entails several things. We want to ensure that criteria are revised. 70% of the criteria account for the rating of the various offers, and these criteria is too preponderant. So we want to revise the price dimension. We also need to look at criteria which aren't differentiating apart from price, so that we need to focus more on the differentiating criteria, i.e. robustness. Over a number of years, CRE has asked that we focus more on the technical solidity, it should account for more than 10 or 15 points when assessing the various tenders. And also we have to look at resilience. That should be a more important criterion. There's been a major turning point in our area of activity because we talk more and more about resilience, but things are not sufficiently ambitious on paper. The regulation published by the European Commission sets out a goal: 40% of production on European soil. But with offshore wind farms, we already have a European industry because the local input is very big. So if we don't revise the criteria, we won't really improve the situation for offshore wind farms. We want to revise things, involve the state more, and resilience as a criterion should immediately be taken into account in the forthcoming calls for tender. I believe that in this respect, we have CRE and DGSE, which share the same viewpoint. I'd like to add 2 more points about these criteria. They have to be fairly homogeneous across Europe. We're not alone on the market. It's a very big market. The more we standardize things, the more there will be visibility for industry, which will be able to become ever more competitive because the volumes will be greater. And also, we want to ensure there's more stability to guarantee this visibility to industry and developers. There's one last point. I think we have to find a right balance between competitiveness for consumers, the robustness of the tenders, and the degree of risk for the developers. Development times are quite long for offshore wind farms, and that doesn't enable developers to secure the situation with the industry because the lapse of time is too lengthy. You have to take all this into account, and we shouldn't launch things that are too risky for the developers. It's a difficult balance to strike, but obviously we have to focus on resilience and more local input. In terms of these criteria, we'd like to hear from CRE and DGSE. Miley has made a number of comments, speaking for Sir. DGSE, what do you think about this? Are you currently working on these criteria pertaining to robustness? These are not topics that are new to us. We do indeed bear all these points in mind. With the specifications for 7 and 8, we focus more on robustness, and I agree with Miley. We have to go even further. We need to realize that the offshore market can change quite rapidly. We could move from a situation where there's a lot of European content to one where there's very little if we don't do anything, because there are few projects, and the few projects there are very big. We're talking about the use of Chinese turbines, for example. This is a topic we address with great interest. It's an opportunity to test new things as well. We can have a very ambitious project when we start negotiations with the European Commission. We were very ambitious. There are some candidates in the room who probably saw a lot of new things in the ONF specifications. Some developers complained also. They said it's a bit more complicated. That creates more uncertainty for the developers. We need to find a happy balance. And there's a lot at stake, industrially speaking. We'll see what the new government has to say, but the previous ministers were very explicit. They said, let's take the requisite time. Let's remain ambitious. We need to award the tender for tender number 10, but we have to take enough time to test projects in terms of resilience, robustness. In XPE, we have to look at, for example, the steel, the country mix. Let's be more discriminating on these various points. This also entails reinforcing the number of points you allocate for robustness. It's very important to recall that things have already evolved since the beginning. The idea is we can't change the 70% that's set out in the criteria, but we could make this these figures a bit more dynamic rather than static. What do you think about the criteria? We very much share the various points mentioned so far. Robustness is very important. As Martin aptly said, in 7 and 8, only 8 points were allocated for robustness. Perhaps this should be ramped up. When it comes to the price, we hope that efforts made in 7 and 8 will be continued, and we agree that it's important to look at the content, the European content component. We should increase that in the years to come because things are ramping up, and it would be a pity if the European input represented a diminishing percentage. Things are really taking off. What are the conditions for success? Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. I was here 3 or 4 years ago, and the group wasn't called SLP, it was called Schlumberger at the time. We changed our name in the meantime. We're a world leader in oil services, and at the time we wondered whether we would venture into wind energy and how we would go about it if we decided to do so. So I'm a newcomer here in this area. I don't claim to represent all the industries involved, but I'd like to explain to you why an international group like Schlumberger decided to think, well, maybe we could have a relevant part to play in this new line of activity. We thought, well, what could we contribute to offshore wind? And we immediately added floating offshore wind farms. If I may, today I'll talk about this specific dimension of things because that's what we deem most relevant when it comes to our company as an industry and the services that have developed around oil and gas. We believe that we can make a contribution. First question. Well, look at the market, which potentially is gigantic. We're talking about gigawatts. And we're talking about billions of euros in potential turnover. And to give you an idea, it's quite easy to convert a watt or a gigawatt. It depends. It's not far from a factor of 2, 3, or 4. And you can convert it into billions of euros. If you're talking about, I don't know, well, earlier on we were talking about 3.5 gigawatts just opposite us in the Mediterranean. 3.5 gigawatts, that's more than 10 billion euros probably in potential business. So that is obviously quite attractive in an area which is not yet mature, that is floating wind farms. Sorry, my microphone or my headset keeps switching off. So there's a huge potential. It's a new line of activity, floating wind farms. So a new player can take up a position and provide something different. The key, obviously, is how we fit in to the supply chain. First thing, third major possibility. Well, there are huge possibilities, huge business opportunities. We have a big plant in Occitania, in Béziers, which makes big mechanical parts, and it looks onto the Mediterranean. It has direct access to the set port. That enables us to distribute our parts around Europe with an environmental footprint which is very small. So we're a big international group, and we thought, well, there's an opportunity. We can do big business here. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. A new supply chain, and then a country like France. We could talk about the groups in this area. We have a very long shoreline. Here we're in the south, floating wind farms in the Mediterranean. It's a potential love story. Floating wind farms in the Mediterranean are a wonderful idea because the water becomes very deep very quickly, and the Atlantic too, North Sea as well. Look at what's happening in the UK and in Scotland and elsewhere. It's an extremely big market, and here we are. Well, thank you very much. You've really sketched out the opportunities. Now, how can we meet our ambitions? What are the challenges that have to be taken up? There are a lot of challenges. I think we've taken up a number of them, in particular the legislative and regulatory challenge. For wind farms, we had a number of laws that were introduced in 2018, 2020, 2023, so we have a much more favorable framework in terms of recourse for offshore wind farms. We have direct access to the State Council, and that saves us a lot of time. There was another major challenge which was talked about a lot in the past 2 years, planning. We needed visibility. Local players said we need more visibility. And on the 17th of October, with the interministerial decision published in the official journal, we accomplished a major step forward. If you look at this situation, we have 15 gigawatts worth of projects. And we know in which order to move forward. There was no need for a public debate. There used to be in the past a public debate, then a project, and then 4 years later there was another public debate and another project. Now we've really speeded things up. With the 20 megawatts, we have much more visibility. Even if we still have to conduct studies, we'll try to rediscuss matters when the documents are updated. So planning is a challenge we seem to have met, and this was a major step forward. Then massification, that's another big challenge. That's what Paul Octave was talking about. We shouldn't talk about just 1 or 2 projects per procedure, because the procedures, the calls for tenders are long, complex, it costs money for the developers. If we're talking about 7 to 8 gigawatts, we've really reached a much more worthwhile scale. And that enabled us to save several months. We can shorten the necessary discussion. So there's this massification when it comes to state services, and it's important to recall it. We can anticipate on the technical and environmental studies, because that is very important in the critical pathway followed by a project. Likewise, the linking with the grid, that's also very important. You have to integrate all these projects in the French grid. We have a 10-year blueprint for developing the French grid, which will be published in 25. Very specifically, there's some areas where we might have to create a line, a ground-based line. That's costly, it's complex. RTE on the market is in competition with a lot of other European companies, so it needs to massify and standardize its purchases. And there's an industrial challenge. A farm with 1 or 2 gigawatts, well, we have pilot wind farms which produce up to 30 gigawatts, so we have to upscale the capacity. And together, we're therefore following the status of the ports very carefully. They're focusing a lot on offshore wind farms. We need to have all the floating capacity. We need to attend to the integration, and it's a new market, so it's quite a big opportunity for the local areas. We have 180 million to grant ports for their development. It may be more if the projects are really of top quality. In January 2025, we should know more where we stand. That also is an important step forward. These are major challenges, and we are familiar with the current political context. The timing is important. We want to allocate the tenders as quickly as possible. When it comes to all these flashpoints, we are indeed moving forward bit by bit.
So we've just talked about these different challenges. We can see there are a lot of them. Martin was also talking about the question of connection. Are there other areas that we need to be vigilant about? Yes, the connection points is very important because we have to be able to calculate it on the basis of the grid. There are the costs as well, which has to be taken into consideration. But these costs ultimately are carried by the consumer. So we're looking at about 50% of overall costs for the project, which is quite considerable. And the GRTs are in competition with one another in Europe to secure the capacity for production of the necessary equipment for connection. There's also the question of knowing really how we're going to be able to sequence the planning of the availability of connection to make sure that it's as quick as possible, but also so that we can optimize the costs, so that we can benefit from opportunities and changes in industrial timing. Sorry, thank you very much. When the production capacities are more developed. Another point that we feel is important is really more downstream, relating to the grid. With the first calls for tender, the opportunity of having negative prices was very theoretical. In 2024, there were 244 hours of negative prices. So with the calls for tender, we have to make sure that the installations can maximize as far as possible their production in these periods and to stop production when there is overcapacity. Recently, an analysis was produced to show the way in which we can adapt the system, but also to be able to install economic savings by adapting to the French grid, so that if there is a softening of the breakings, the downtime in the plants, it's important to be able to use renewable during this time. So we're having a lot of discussions about this again, these are very much upstream of the activity. But we need to have these discussions today so that we can avoid surprises in the future. So this is very important that we're able to look at the various vigilance points You agree, basically? And are you in phase with what we're saying here? Yeah, I might add the question of the scale change in terms of the industry offshore. When we look at the annual delivery capacities, it means that we need 12 to 14 gigawatts per year, which gives an idea of the way we're going to have to triple the capacities between now and 2035 if we're going to meet our ambitions. With the 18 gigawatts, this is for France, but it's over 30 for Germany, which so they've got in the UK, for example, there are even higher ambitions with 60 gigawatts. So we're really seeing a scale change here, which is massive. And the March, if we look at the floating turbines, for example, we can reduce the risk. But it took us 3.5 years to produce 3 floating turbines, whereas we're going to be having to really increase that number considerably in the future. We are seeing this scale change in a situation where we're having difficulty preserving our industry, and yet we have to invest in new capacities. So there's this paradox of having to increase the rate, but we don't have the necessary conditions to be able to preserve our assets in the French context. This means that we have to use criteria, and there are other ways of doing this. The first point is to make sure that we keep to the schedule. It's important to give visibility on the upcoming calls for tender for 25, 26. We have to also be able to provide visibility, and we're talking about 11 or perhaps number 12 that would need to be dealt with. And another point is in terms of acceleration. The DGSE said that it's important to accelerate, which means that we have to grant more quickly. All the calls for tender are late at the moment, and we hope that this will no longer be the case for the next batch of calls for tender. So in this way that we'll be able to reduce the delay of the period between the granting of the call for tender and the investment period, which is very structuring to avoid to make sure that we're able to secure the whole value chain. It's also a matter really of accompanying and support for the development of these infrastructures. This is particularly true for floating wind turbines. We've got a lot more to do. In other areas, we're well established, but I think we'll have to give more visibility, go further. The first envelope was 180 million, but it was not sufficient. And today, I think we need a better vision and a port business model so that we can specialize in this area and that the developers can really position themselves in the offers that they're making. There are other issues as well, another challenge, particularly in the nautical area, where we know it's going to be difficult in terms of installing cables and installing turbines out at sea, but we'll also be finding difficulties. No, we're following, don't you, Ryan? Yes, the ports and the cables. I was a bit lost in my list there in the nautical conditions, but I'm sorry, I've forgotten the last point. It'll come back. But all this really to say that we need this visibility in industrial terms, and we're going to be upscaling considerably. And we have to be able to make sure that this is well orchestrated so that we can meet the challenges of tomorrow. Thank you very much. So we've just been talking about scale changing. We're all very aware of this aspect. So there's energy sovereignty, and there's industrial sovereignty, and now we have to organize ourselves so that we can carry along the whole industrial system. I think this really is the main aim at the moment, if there is one, is to make sure that these projects continue with a European industry and, as far as possible, French. I think we talked a lot about the NCDR because there are a number of different criteria which are important. There's budget, for instance, but there are other tools which allow us to favor port investment. I think as well, it's true that when we're looking at offshore, we have to make sure that We can use the various regional clusters as well to accompany this sector. This is an area which is perhaps easier to work with in terms of specifications. So we need to spend time looking at the various SMEs that are going to be able to working alongside us. And I think this is an important point. We're going to have to keep calm about this in a system which is accelerating fast in terms of ambition. Inevitably, there are new sets of problems that will arise. For an example, a concrete example of this, we had exchanges with the Ministry of the Army in terms of the necessary compensation required to make sure that these projects actually see the light. There are over 10 projects whose permission for which was cancelled because they interfered with radar systems. And so it's very important to. We're working with the marine companies at the moment, and it's not an easy thing to carry out these exchanges. There's a question of sovereignty, energy sovereignty, but there's a question of sovereignty in general. So it's very important before we go into producing these specifications to make sure that we reach an agreement in terms of the size of our turbines and the areas that are concerned. 5 years ago, this issue was dealt with by saying, okay, we'll see later how we don't need to anticipate things at the moment, whereas today we're saying, no, it's absolutely essential to do this at planning stage, and we have to get rid of all the possible constraints, and this is essential before we move to calls for tender. We know that it's a complicated situation. This requires time, this requires money, and even 6 months longer than what was planned. This 6 months will probably be necessary to deal with the new set of problems which arise. So if we're looking at a call for projects for 8 to 10 gigawatts, I think it's worth taking these precautions at the beginning. So all these constraints, I think, as of the AO10, we've been saying, okay, we have a problem for 18 gigawatts in France. We already have a huge challenge from an industrial point of view. We have a lot of challenges in terms of connection in time. And for the 11 and 12, the main challenge is to make sure that we can keep up to time, in time to make these call for tenders. So we're going to move on with this point a little bit further. Paul-Olivier, Octave, we have to bring out a whole industrial ecosystem related to floating wind turbines. So where do you start? Yes, my fellow speakers here have been, we can see that the state and the regions are committed, which is great news. It's important to invest in international industry in the Occitania region, but this doesn't protect us from competition, whereby all the floaters may come from Asia, for instance. We have invested, we've taken the risk of investing in France, in the Occitania region, in a factory in Béziers, which was intended for oil and gas. And we're completely renewing a section of this factory, especially for floating wind turbines. Obviously, when you take a risk like this, you say, wow, is everybody going to follow on? And this is critical. Everything that's been said up to now, I wouldn't go back on. But as far as I'm concerned, there are several challenges. One of them today, when we talk about floating wind turbines, is the advances in technology. The other day, we were talking about 90 different types of floating turbines, and there are people sort of fighting for the right type of prototype. But at a certain point, there has to be convergence, and we have to reduce it to a certain number so that the whole chain is able to actually produce these floaters and optimize based on a certain number of designs. This will be done in time. But the other aspect, which is critical, is how the way in which we can assemble a value chain. What we wanted to do is that on the strength of our competence and our ability to produce very large mechanical elements, as well as our understanding, our unique understanding of digital in the world. If I can digress for a moment here, we have an automated chain in Béziers, which does mechanical parts on the basis of models. It produces small elements. They're within 80 square cubic meter area. So 3 years ago, we invested in an automated chain for this. Thanks to this, we will be able to repatriate elements that we used to produce in Malaysia and China, and we can produce them more cheaply in Béziers. It's true. So we're able to do this more cheaply in Béziers. So it's not inevitable. There's no inevitability about having to import from abroad. We are able to do this. And once again, on the strength of this experience, we said, okay, well, so much for our oil and gas industry in terms of the mechanical parts. So we thought, well, maybe we could do this for offshore wind turbines. There's a lot of familiarity, or the oil and gas industry is very familiar with what's happening offshore. So we launched into investment, very heavy investment. We've never invested as much in France in the past. And this is the biggest investment of the SL group in terms of manufacturing in the world, and this is taking place in Béziers. And to be able to produce major parts for anchoring, the major mechanical parts of the floaters, we have to be able to assemble the sub-assemblies as well. So we go for it, and the risk that remains, nevertheless, is that we think that we're going to be very competitive compared to the competition, not even on a European basis, but we're speaking here in terms of Chinese or Korean competition. To what extent are we going to be able, here in France and in Europe, we have to play the European game, but for all the different chains in this, all the different links in the chain will be competitive as well. So there has to be a kind of inventory of resources and skills and competencies. So if we determine who does what, if I'm competitive, even if I'm not part of the sector, we weren't part of the sector 3 years ago. We've just joined it, really. So first of all, we have to make an inventory of what already exists in the sector, which doesn't exist, but which can be very relevant because of the competences in previous skill areas, which was our case. And then the question then is to say, how do we go about doing this? How do we go around the table to get together and say, okay, you're going to do this part, we'll produce this other part, etc., obviously according to the rules of competition. But who coordinates this? And as an industrialist, for example, and there are a number of them around us here, we have organizations which are here, fortunately, to represent their sector. It turns out that I'm chairman of an association of the previous oil and gas groups, which are in the process of changing. We have 300 companies involved, and they're very motivated in participating in the ecosystem. So there has to be an associative context as well, which is very important. But what's also very important is public authorities, whether they be regional or national, meaning, and even supranational on a European basis. So how do we go about making this inventory, knowing who is relevant and who isn't, and trusting the other as well? I think we will feel even freer and more inclined to invest if I know that right next to me I'm going to have a number of people, friends, colleagues, who will be relevant and with whom we will perhaps be able to do business to set up this very competent sector. Don't forget, it's a very complex chain. We're talking about ports on one hand. We're talking about grid connections. There are people involved producing turbines. There are the people producing the floaters. It's a complicated process. Other companies, without mentioning them, towards Asia, and very much towards the West on the other side, are far better organized than we are in creating this sort of collective group. And this is our challenge as well. So we're going to be talking very quickly because we'd like to be able to hand over for questions. But you talked about the Béziers plant. Do we have an answer here? I mean, have you already started making an inventory of the various resources and competences available in the area or on national level? Yeah, we've created something which is completely new for us. We created our Eden. So Eden is the sustainable ecosystem for renewable energies. In Béziers, the way in which we began this energy transition within the SLB group, Schlumberger previously, was through hydrogen. So we set up a joint venture called GenVA. Some of you know this, perhaps. GenVA is a joint venture between the CEA and SLB, as a minor partner in the Occitanie region. It was a first for us, public-private joint venture, an organization of a public organization on one hand and a large industrial partner on the international level. What happens within this group, Eden? Who belongs to this ecosystem, for example? Who's committed to it? Well, it's on an industrial basis, for example. We began with GenVA and SLB and hydrogen, but then the region was involved. We decided to create a gigafactory to produce electrolyzers of tomorrow. We're moving forward well with this. This means that in 5 years' time, we'll be needing between 500 and 2,000 people for the factory. We need land, we need skills, and all of this goes well beyond the decision from an industrial point of view. The local public authorities also have to be stakeholders. The state has to help as well because they also need finance in disruptive technology, and it's always a great pleasure for me to come to the Occitanie region, particularly thanks to the leadership of Madame Delga, the president of the region, to see that in this ecosystem we can get together and say, so I'm going to take the land risk aspect, and we have a potential of 150 hectares for our factory, for our plant, which is not the problem of zero artificialization doesn't come in, and in one of the branch of the institute, the University Institute of Technology in Béziers is involved with this, so via artificial intelligence. We're also working at regional scale, which is which I very much believe in. So we're widening our activities from hydrogen, where the state was at a 7 billion investment, and at this point we may need an IBC for floating turbines, wind turbines. So before I get your feedback from the audience, we were talking just now about skills and competence. So this is a real issue because we may have all the ambition we want in the world. If we don't have the necessarily arms to provide the answers, it's the problem. Yes, we were talking about the dynamics here, and this actually involves a number of additional jobs. On a regular basis, we're looking at 8,000 in France, and there are 1,000 additional jobs per year, which we need. We're seeing the same trend in Europe. This involves skills, and these are very much sought after at the moment, not only for floating turbines, but also for the nuclear industry, automobiles, building, construction, and aeronautics. And obviously, there's a difficulty in recruiting a number of jobs which are under pressure, and it's important to have an with the Observatory for Maritime Employment. It's very important within the floating turbine context to be able to confirm that welders, for example, environmental engineers, maintenance technicians are jobs which are looked for and for which we have a real need. So this will be the case tomorrow. We know that there are going to be 6 PR2 projects up for 2038. These are consistent with the calendar for maritime jobs. For our immediate needs, we need to give greater visibility to our sector. Some great initiatives have been taken by talking to other sectors to give greater visibility to maritime energies, or maritime-based energies. We're all very well aware of the interest of this sector. It may involve retraining, for example, in the automobile industry, which is suffering at the moment. Also, we need to develop communication tools for the wider public. We have a working blue site which lists all the jobs in the sector. We have a forum as well for jobs in the sector with initiatives which can be put up on a bigger, put out on a wider scale. And we have some, for example, the Chantier de l'Atlantique, which is a shipbuilding on the Atlantic side. We can use their welders and some of their other skilled workers. We've developed the school of the network school with Enedis and other companies and state organizations. And I think in this way we can really continue to develop the response to tomorrow's needs in jobs. We're getting support, particularly for with the upcoming projects to be announced. So one particular, which is Capima, which is announcing training programs related to offshore floating turbines. And these are the kinds of initiatives which we will be able to use to deal with this problem, and we're optimistic about it. Thank you for your optimism. So we're going to hand the microphone now for your questions. If you have a question, do please raise your hand or a reaction. So we've got the mic that's ready with a question right here at the front on the right. Do please introduce yourself, madam. Hello, Marianne de Smet. I'm working for the Definer company. We come from the nuclear and aeronautics, but thanks to the funding from the region, we've developed an overall solution which makes it possible to automate a section of the preventive maintenance tasks for wind turbines. How do we get acceptance of solutions which are perhaps in contradiction with a number of benefits? Because we reduce the cost of maintenance, for example, reduce mobilization, so we increase productivity. But as part of the calls for tender and what's been set up, how can this be a criterion factor in terms of something which should be picked up? Yes, a very good question. Can we have a quick answer so we can take as many questions as possible?
C'est une très bonne question.
It's a very good question. Yes, to start with, I think that calls for tender are not there really to be prescriptors of technology. This is an important thing to remember. We've already discussed with the European Commission to try to neutralize things between wind turbines and hydrogen, but we feel that it's very important to make it very clear to make sure which technology we're using, and it's up to the developer to adopt this point. Earlier we were talking about the development of the AOCs on a territorial basis, and it's very important to remind people of the local situation. When there's a public meeting, for example, and somebody wants to work in the maintenance area, the developers are going to be taking note of this in the meeting. And I think it's very important that we have this territorial monitoring committee which has been set up so that we can go to the developers and get them to explain what their industrial choices will be. And this pressure, which isn't written into any of the text, exists, but it's a useful thing to make sure that we make the right choices in terms of local employment. If I were a developer, I'm not, but if I were, I would say that if you have a solution which means that we can reduce my OPEC, I'm happy to buy it. The question is, what are you doing to be known to buy the developer upstream? And this is what I was saying. How far are we able to create a collective group with an inventory of all the available intelligence so that we're able to find an optimized solution? And Evolen, Eden, SER, and all the other organizations would be involved. Thank you very much. So I'm going to, on my right, are there any questions or comments? Right at the front row. We'll be bringing you the mic.
Et je vous invite à vous présenter.
And please introduce yourself.
Bonjour, Francis Parmentier.
Hello, Francis Parmentier, General Director of Berlin. In terms of the collective idea, Christophe Moulin was talking about creating, or the future creation of a strategic community for the sector in the region. Olivier was speaking about Eden, and we can see the need of pooling our needs and ideas and strengths. And I wanted really to talk about the fact that there's already a national strategic committee for work at sea. The DGU was involved, and the ecological transition ministry was involved as well. And I think that would be a good idea. What we could do next year would be to make sure, because this is the first time I've heard about a regional strategic committee dedicated to a particular sector, i.e. floating offshore. And I think it would be a good idea to pull together all this next year. The series involved, Evelyn's participating. We're talking about the maritime or the availability of ships earlier as well. I think it would be a great thing if we could really pool all these needs in France.
Thank you very much for your reaction. Are there any other reactions or contributions from the room? Yes, go ahead, sir. Wait for the microphone, please.
Merci de vous présenter. Bonjour.
Please introduce yourself.
Bonjour, donc Mathieu Blandin, Société
Mathieu
Valémo,
Lombard,
également administrateur
Valémo,
de cluster d'entreprises, notamment
and
Néopolien,
I
Pays de Loire.
run a cluster of enterprises. We belong to France Offshore. We comprise a number of other clusters like Windhoek and so on and so forth. We cover almost all the coasts of France. The idea is to bring together all the small and medium-sized companies along the value chain who are not pure payers. They're represented in the national syndicates, and the idea is to round off the chain, the value chain, and get our companies used to this new line of activity. We've talked a lot about the prospects for the tender 9 and 10. However, we're talking about projects up to 2035. We have pilot wind farms which are currently functioning. What will happen when it comes to Dunkirk and AO5 in southern Brittany? We're waiting a decision for the Mediterranean and so forth. What about the monitoring of the impact in terms of local contact? To structure a value chain for 2035 creates jobs and training, and all this is essential. But we could perhaps implement this already when it comes to the allocated projects for wind farms. So I'd like to turn to Jacques, what will be the follow-up to ensure that this first set of achievements will meet the deadlines when it comes to administrative authorizations. We talk about this gap between the launching of the tender, the actual allocation of the tender, and then the allocation of administrative authorizations so that the farms can be financed and decisions can be taken. And this obviously has a huge impact on the whole of the value chain. Thank you very much. Well, there were a lot of points in that question. When it comes to administrative authorizations, indeed, these are projects which are increasingly big and complex in France. The developers do the in situ studies, give the content of the environmental studies, and then there's an impact study which is submitted to the prefecture, and that is then followed by a study and an authorization. It takes 15 to 18 months, in fact, to provide an authorization once the whole of the file has been received. So perhaps that's too long. There are two positive points, however. Obviously, we recall the challenges and the possible impact. There's another challenge when it comes to the following situation. When it comes to an environmental evaluation, we have Centre-Manche 1 and 2, and the two links to the grid are viewed as a single environmental impact issue, whereas in fact the timelines are different. The topic is extremely complex. You have to get authorization from the environmental authorities. There is this desynchronization in the request for authorization, which is quite an issue. So what we want to do is to develop a true doctrine, whereby we could say, now this desynchronization will take place for all wind farms. We'll explain how things work, and we'll try and get this improved by the environmental authorities, by biodiversity and the various entities that deal with the environmental impact. This is not public necessarily, but we realize that we need to get things to speed up. And then we have the quality of the files which are registered with us. We're talking about bigger and bigger projects, and we need we realize that people may question the authorizations granted, and we'll have to be in a position to defend the project which we have authorized. We want to ensure also that they are not open to litigation. One last question, and then we'll focus on the future high-power sites. We'll receive a representative from OpenSea. Hello, Marie-Laure Barrois, Windog. It's more, in fact, a testimony than anything else. On a regional level, Windog has co-built the mega cluster France Offshore Renewables with the other regions. The idea is to make this line of activity attractive. It's good to work together to create local, regional, and national momentum. In any event, we've already been working up and running for a number of years. We get support from the Mediterranean Pole, Cemetery, the region, EnerGaïa. We comprise a large number of entrepreneurs. We are a big group. We have members of academia, industry, SMEs. We have consultants, research laboratories. And indeed, we're here. We're very much present. And we create a lot of momentum in the region. Indeed, we have to make this line of activity attractive also for young people. So you're present at EnerGaïa, and there will be a buffet at the end of the morning. Well, congratulations and thank you. This was a very interesting debate. Congratulations to all our speakers. Thank you to all our